Hi, and welcome to another episode of Time Extend. My name is Adam Ismail, and joining me today, as always, is
Brendan Morrison. And, well, Adam, I missed out in the last episode, but I'm glad to be back because we are going to be discussing a series that people have been longing for. They want us to discuss the best games in the series. We're going to be looking at Burnout, but we're not going to be looking at arguably the best games in the series, and for me that's the most time extend type approach we can take to such a popular series.
Right. So the thing is, we could talk about Burnout 3, Burnout Revenge, Burnout Paradise, probably be a little bit about Revenge today, but the thing is, everyone knows those games to be brilliant. I'm sure Burnout Paradise, especially by this point, you've probably played on at least 3 different platforms. So, we all know how those games are. They're great. But what gets less talked about are the first game. The second game gets some praise, but especially the first game. I almost forget there was a Burnout 1. And until recently, I completely forgot about Dominator and... Brendan, you put yourself through hell playing the DS port of Legends, which is just you always, when we do shows like this and we go back and we play games in series, you always go for the worst ones, and I admire that.
Know. I think there's just something chaotic about bad racing game ports or impossible racing game ports, because more than any other series you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole effectively, because especially for a series like Burnout, it's basically based around this incredible showcase of visuals and speed, and then you're trying to put it on a platform like the DS that does not accommodate for that in the slightest. It just felt as if somebody had to take a look at it, and as we found out through the Twitter, there's always at least 1 or 2 people saying, "Oh man, I loved playing this back in the day." So somebody has to look out for those little guys.
Yeah, and we've talked about DS racing games before too, especially Race Driver, Create and Race, and Grid and all that stuff. And even the most impressive ones, except for Mario Kart DS, you tried to fool yourself. You Stockholm syndromed yourself into thinking oh, this is so impressive on a handheld, while deliberately ignoring that the PSP existed and just trying to think look at what it's doing for the system, but is it really a good game? Not really. But that's how it was. That's how it was at the time.
Yeah, especially because at the time, when you think about what the PSP was capable of by comparison to the DS, I would argue we've never really had that level of incredible disparity between consoles. So obviously, you could look at the Wii U versus the PS4 and that sort of thing, but you would still roughly get a similar experience in games just running worse, whereas the DS and PSP were capable of such different things, so they're barely comparable.
Sure, I mean the 2-screen thing for one, and even comparing the Switch and PS5 or Series X, you're not going to get the visual fidelity of an experience on a next-gen system, or I guess current-gen now, on the Switch, but if what a lot of developers do is they just turn everything down, so you end up with games like WRC 10 that run on Switch, and okay, doesn't look good really at all, but it runs, it is the game, it just looks bad. So it was an interesting time, and even going back, we can start at the beginning, and I played I dug into Burnout 1 and 2 on the GameCube because, let's be honest, it was the easiest to emulate, and I don't own either of those games. And, there were even some differences between, the versions that would release on PS2 and GameCube versus the ones on the Xbox. In the case of Burnout 2, there was, a director's cut that came out later on Xbox, I believe. And those were always, the definitive editions. They usually had, a little bit more content, which always kind of stood out in games like those because they didn't have a lot. You go back to that first Burnout, and I think when I started playing that game, I texted you, and I was like, "This feels so quaint. It feels like a budget title." And I know that sounds bad, and obviously I'm aware it released in 2001. They were going for an arcade racing game, and Criterion had made stuff before then, but it wasn't. They never made a racing game quite like that. And so I'm sure it was a learning experience, and they were really trying to get to the root of what a fun arcade racing experience would be. But as a result of that, like, there's very limited content. There aren't a lot of cars. You know, we're talking about time before Crash Mode. It's a cute experience, but it does feel like it came. You know, you can see the seeds for what would come later, but it's also, the production values are so not there that it also feels like something completely different. It's a very surreal thing to explain.
I think like the original Burnout, it's very easy for people who've even played it a lot, and the series entries that would follow, it's very easy to forget it's in the same series in many ways, because for me, Burnout, the original game, actually has a lot more in common with like coin-op arcade racers, and one of the weird parallels I think you can draw is like to Sega Rally 1995 in terms of like being a very concentrated experience of few tracks, few cars. There's a specific gimmick to the gameplay. It's almost incredible that it was a released game in the first place because of that, because like you say, it's the games box art and the back of the packaging talks about these like exhilarating crashes and exhilarating speed and that sort of thing, but when you actually play the game, it feels more like a beta for like something else that would come later. And I think that's really interesting, because when the game was being made, it must have been obvious that to create the type of experience they wanted, they would require a higher budget, they would require a bit more resources, that sort of thing, but they still went through with it. And it makes the original Burnout very odd, because it almost feels like a released, well, it would be alpha, I guess, version.
It feels
of
like a tech
Burnout
demo.
3 would become. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's it. And I know, like you saying, 2001, very early PS2 era, so like maybe you can give it a pass in that regard. But it's not as if like it had a lot of contemporaries with that little content either. So it's so strange. Like the fictional cars feel like an afterthought asset flip or something from like an engine library.
It almost looks like something you'd like find on like some kind of Blender community or something today, you know?
Absolutely. The tracks are just random highways with maybe a few turns off the beaten track, and it almost feels like a tech demo for Renderware, I believe it was. That was the kind of back then.
And that really plays into it, because like, you know, with Criterion, it's funny that like the people who, you know, enjoy racing games like we do, listen to the show, maybe like we think of Criterion as the people who make Burnout and Need for Speed, and obviously having been part of EA for, you know, more than 15 years now, but like they are responsible for one of the most prolific, important middleware products in game development in like the early to mid 2000s. I mean, they made Burnout, you know, undoubtedly because they wanted to make a racing game like this, but also to showcase what Renderware could do. And they're showcasing what their technology is capable of at a time when their technology is also like very early in development. So it's funny how Criterion kind of became known as like these technical wizards that were pushing things like 60 frames per second, these amazing like vehicle deformation, crash effects, the post-processing of like the fire coming out of the car when you hit the boost and all that stuff. Like they made very pretty games, but the first Burnout is not one of those games because they were very early on in that process. And if you look at the stuff that they made before this, Trick Style, which when I was a kid, and we had a Dreamcast, I played Trick Style, and I loved that game. I thought it was so cool. I didn't realize it was a Criterion project until many years later, and that kind of blew me away. But yeah, they're not, you know, they it's almost like they kind of made these sort of simplified, almost indie-like experiences to sort of prove what their technology could do. And, you know, fortunate for us, it ended up becoming a very big thing.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really interesting about the first game and why it's worth revisiting for people. It might be a quaint experience, but it's almost a rare view into the life cycle of how a game like Burnout 3 happens, but we actually get to play the first step in getting there, because it's a weird game, because it's so devoid of personality for the most part. The gameplay itself is kind of a lesser, less interesting version of what would come later, but it does still feel like, for a Burnout fan such as myself and such as yourself as well, Adam, like it's it's a weird insight into how a project like that starts life, and when a company wants to achieve something but it has limited resources, it can still actually push out a product that approximates the full-on blockbuster experience it could get to. But it's very interesting, because when you look at the reception at the time, as I often do when we're looking at these games, I look at what the reception was like when the first game came out. It was actually heralded pretty well as a nice showcase of what the PS2 was capable of, for the reasons we've talked about. Just to call attention to the performance of the game as well. Like, you're talking a very, very steady frame rate here. In the EU, it actually had options for 50Hz and 60Hz, which is not something that you would get in every game over here by any means, as is often clear through the PlayStation Classic being re-released and that sort of thing, and the terrible performance of those games. Criterion actually, in both Burnout and Burnout 2, offered that ability to change the kind of the output TV, which was fantastic. And it's a strange game. I don't think it's ever something I'd ever recommend someone from a gameplay perspective of, you must play this. But I think it's kind of like seeing the pre-cut version of like a Hollywood movie or something, in terms of like that this is what the rough vision of the director was and this is what they wanted to achieve. For me, that's like what Burnout is from Criterion. We think this is a great concept. Here's what we're able to get to at this point. Let's ship it out there, get it in people's hands, see how it gets on, and take it from there. Because in terms of raw content, as we've described, you're not going to find a lot to keep you busy. I believe modes-wise, you've got obviously races, time trials. But the pursuit mode only came into effect for Burnout 2.
It was in 2. Yeah, that was in 2. So you didn't even have, like, obviously you would gain boosts in all of the ways that you typically would, except obviously for takedowns, because that came much later in the series. But you didn't, like, you think about all the things that made, like, say, Burnout 3 feel really novel is, like, you had road rage, you had I think Marked Man, I don't know if it was in that game or it might have been Revenge or Come Later, but like, the typical Burnout modes. Dominator added a lot. The Maniac events and stuff like that. It's just all missing from Crash, of course. It's all missing from this game. And like, you can kind of see like Three Fields Entertainment, which is responsible for Dangerous Driving, and so they're the team of a lot of ex-Criterion Burnout developers, including Fiona Sperry, who ran the studio, and Alex Ward, who directed a lot of the Burnout games. He says pretty much outright, they did kind of a retrospective, and it's something everybody should read, but he says outright, like, I was inspired by Ridge Racer, by Outrun. Need for Speed on the 3DO was a big one, and particularly the crashes in that game, which I've never played Need for Speed on the 3DO. I've played it on the 32-bit consoles, the other ones, but it was a more realistic experience than a lot of racing games at the time. But in as much as like there was traffic and you could crash into it, and that's not something that was necessarily the case, obviously, in like a Ridge Racer or something else. So they were really driven by street racing in the context of like a risk-reward type thing. Another game that was mentioned as a big influence for Burnout is one that we've never really talked about before, and to be honest, I had overlooked for a very long time. But are you familiar with Thrill Drive?
I am not.
So Thrill Drive is actually a series of racing games, arcade games by Konami. They never left the arcades. They were released in the West, at least several of them. They came out between 98 and I think the last one came out in 2007. So it actually ran for a decent amount of time. But they are very, very weird games. Visually, I would say that like the first Thrill Drive looks a lot like Burnout 1.
Right.
In that you're driving very standard road cars on in traffic scenarios and stuff like that, and trying not to crash. What's actually crazy about Thrill Drive is that they have real cars, but they're unlicensed, which is something that, like, if you see the crashes in this game and the way that the game presents it, they would get sued into oblivion. Because, like,
wow, it's
basically like Burnout, but it's like horror. Like, they want to, like, freak you out. Like, it's just kind of got this very unsettling vibe. and it's almost like a horror porn type thing. Like they,
Wow.
when you crash, you will hear the blood-curdling scream of your driver or other people. The driver will fly out of the windshield almost every single time. The crashes look absolutely horrific. The word fatality just like flashes on the screen in Japanese text. It is heavy. Like, it's really heavy. And I think Burnout's really funny in context of that, because while it definitely shares a visual style with that game, it's almost like, what if we can do this but maybe not make people as sad?
Mate, that just sounds very strange, but it's piqued my interest. I can't say I've ever seen a cab for it over here. I'm sure they do exist, but maybe I've just missed it or been too busy playing Sega Rally a million times.
I've never seen it over here, and they released a couple of them, but it's a very strange series too, because it's like, it's almost like they weren't sure, like, is this supposed to like titillate people, or are we supposed to be making like a very serious, sobering statement about the importance of road safety? Because like in the attract mode of the game, it's just repeat cuts of like cars crashing, and it says like after they crash, there's like a huge like dun, and it says like ignoring red light like flashes on the screen, and then the next one that happens again, it's like not wearing a seatbelt. Like it is so strange. It's not a game that like even I really ever paid attention to. I think I'd seen the name before. I didn't know Konami developed it. But yeah, so just a neat little aside as we're talking about Burnout. I wanted to make sure that we recognize Thrill Drive because it is so strange.
I'm very intrigued now. Just when you were describing like those the videos and stuff, it just made me think of Runabout as well.
Yeah,
just thinking about those random flashing up on screen stuff. As soon as you mentioned something like that, I immediately go to Runabout. But that sounds interesting. Is there a modern way of acquiring and playing those games?
You would just have to. I just have to play it on MAME. I think I was watching a video, and unfortunately, I can't remember who the YouTuber was that played it, but he was saying that he's in ownership of like one of the only actual boards of one of those games that exists still, because they've all just been they've all
it's
just
almost like an
gone
urban
away.
legend or something, man. Like the
Yeah.
way you're describing it, the fact that it's kind of hard to track down real cabinets.
It's a
shit.
kind of game that like if anyone knew about, like if anyone with like more reach knew about, like it would be huge because it's so weird. It's just so strange. And actually some of the flyers call it like a real driving safety simulator or something like that. So yeah, it's like they wanted, I felt like they almost hedged their bets where it was like we could draw people in who are really attracted to gore and death, but we could also draw people in who like, you know, take road safety very seriously.
Man, I'm really intrigued to see this now, and we should absolutely amplify some funny screenshots from those videos. That's exactly what I'm going to do after this episode.
Yeah, sounds good. I knew it would amuse you, but yeah. So you know, Burnout 1 is not a game that even, I mean, among people who enjoy the series, and there are lots of them, like Burnout 1 tends to get ignored.
Yeah.
And you know, as you were saying, it's interesting as like sort of an oddity to go back and see how the series was, but don't, you know, bend over backwards trying to get a copy of it to experience that, because you know, part of it too is like the sequel, you know, Burnout 2 Point of Impact. It only came out a year later, depending on the platform, actually less than a year later.
Yeah.
And you know, it's almost like a 1.5. And it's weird because there are some people out there who really, really love Burnout 2, and they almost think like Burnout 3 has gotten so big that's almost kind of turned people off. Like there always seems to be this rejection of something that's like super popular to a point where there are going to be these people on the fringes who are like, no, actually 2 was better, you know? Even though I think at the time 3 came out, there wasn't a single person who thought that 2 was still better. But yeah, some people will act like it's, and I've seen the phrase perfect sequel kind of, you know, associated with it. And, you know, if this is your highlight of the series, I'm not trying to take anything away from you. That's fine. It's a great game. But like, to me, it just feels like what the first game should have been and what I'm sure they wanted the first game to be. it just has enough content to actually make it a full game. It doesn't really mess with the formula that much. The whole thing about burnout chaining that was present in the first game, the racing feels pretty much the same. Visually, it's a little bit better. The car crashes, the deformation is improved, but like, it feels like the first game was sort of a beta for this. And, it's still a great game. It's just always been one that's like, its significance, the love around it has always kind of missed me a little bit. But I think that's because 3 was the first one I really, played. And once you've experienced that, I think it is a little bit hard to go back if you didn't grow up with the series.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. What I've always tried to understand is the viewpoint you've just said there, Adam, about why people think 2 could be better or just as good as 3. And for me, I think it's 2's absolutely the peak of the initial gameplay introduced in Burnout 1, where I would argue 1 and 2 are a lot more harsh on people playing the game that the way Burnout's supposed to be played. For me, it's one of these things where the game is about spectacular crashes and basically causing a bit of chaos as you drive. But I think in those first 2 games, it's very much a case of frustration as opposed to raw thrills when you play the game. So like, Burnout 3 amplifies everything to 110% and definitely streamlines the main gameplay loop. But I think maybe it's like a more narcissistic point of view from people in terms of preferring 2 because it still maintains that air of, we will punish you so harshly for making the simplest of mistakes. Because for me, the first 2 games really follow that philosophy of like almost trying to discourage you from playing the way that you're supposed to play. Obviously, the main core component of the game is being able to drive in the face of danger and build up boost chains, that sort of thing. But I would argue that from 3 onwards, it actually shifted more towards you do that by causing absolute carnage, whereas maybe the first 2 games don't dip into that quite as much. So maybe that's why some people prefer 2, just because it maintains that level of risk and reward that maybe 3 onwards kind of it doesn't have as much in high value. I don't know if you agree with that, but I feel like from 3 onward it was more about creating that thrilling experience by giving people the accessibility of how crazy the game could be, whereas in 1 and 2 you kind of have to earn that ability to really drive on the edge.
Yeah, and I actually want to highlight a comment made by one of the folks in our Discord. So we started something new alongside this, which we should probably give a little bit more attention on Twitter so people know about it. But when we do episodes like this, what we want to do going forward where we explore a series is, instead of like keeping it a secret as to what we're going to play next, which really doesn't serve anybody, let you know what's coming, and also like invite you to play it at the same time that we do. So, you could leave comments or whatever, or you could not play the game and leave comments. I mean, we won't know the difference. And we can kind of go through it together. So a number of people, I think it's the Time Extend Game Club was
That's
the name
it.
that you came up with, Bren. So good one. It's like a book club, but with games. A number of people kind of chimed in with some of their thoughts, and Murdo, who I think just joined the server, and also just like, I think before we even said anything, like in the DMs when they asked, they're like, I love Burnout, so they're a super fan. But they kind of hit the nail on the head. They say Burnout 1 and mostly 2 just capture the simplicity of a no extra thrills classic arcade racing game. If you'd be recommending any racing game, you'd always recommend 3 or Revenge to someone, but those don't have the same charm. They were more realistic in graphics, even more edgy, but they aren't as simple, which isn't a bad thing, but I think Burnout 2 mostly stands out as a pillar of its very specific niche for that reason. And yeah, I mean, this is, I think if you do kind of sort of look for that more technical, punishing experience, Burnout 2 is that game. And, when 3 introduced takedowns, for me, that was kind of the missing, and I think for a lot of people, that was kind of the missing piece of the puzzle that kind of made the melding between like damage and racing, destruction and racing sort of work. Before then, I played a little bit of Burnout 2 when I was a kid, and I just didn't get it. But the thing is that the takedowns, they do kind of water down the racing experience, because every time you take someone down, your boost bar gets extended and filled, and that can kind of create this sort of thing where like, and not to, everyone harps on, you know, how important skill should be in the game, but like, and I'm not someone who's ever really felt super strongly about that, but yeah, it does kind of give you a crutch to win those races that you otherwise maybe wouldn't. So I can understand how some people kind of have that feeling about 2 versus the later games looking back.
Yeah, absolutely. I always sum it up when I think about these games in my head when I'm trying to work out what type of experience they provide. For me, Burnout 1 and then 2, obviously being the better of the 2 games, manages to have that type of experience that always has me kind of in that twitchy gameplay mode of like knowing that if I flick the analog stick a slight bit too much, I'll fuck things up, or if I try and do a daft move, I'll usually get punished for it. And it creates a very kind of slightly infuriating at times experience, but one which you really do feel as if you've got to be fully tuned in and aware of everything that's happening around you, including the traffic and the cars that you're racing. Burnout 3 onwards, for me, is more of like a tour de force of what you can actually get from that style of gameplay when everything's just unchained and on loose. I don't think it's the same type of experience, oddly. Obviously they're part of the same series and it's an evolution of the concept, but for me 3 onwards was more about like showing to everybody how fun this type of gameplay could be without having to arduously earn it by playing through 3 tracks over and over again in the case of the first game, or on the second game in terms of the late game elements. So for that reason, I can see why people might take the slightly contrarian view that 2 is better than 3. I personally can't see that, just cards on the table. I really do think 2 is enjoyable. I think it kind of renders the first game a bit pointless, aside from the reasons for exploring it we've talked about earlier in the pod. But I think like the kind of origins of Burnout were more heavily invested in that 90s arcade racer bit we're talking about of you don't need a lot of content, you don't need a lot of cars, what you need to learn is to get good. And it's like that's where the real loop comes from, whereas I think 3 onwards was more about that constant rewarding of the player through the gameplay mechanics itself, through the kind of plethora of content that were there, the many different game modes, that sort of thing. Because 2, once again, you added pursuits that we kind of briefly talked about earlier. Crash mode, of course, makes its debut, and we could argue that framed the rest of the series, really, once that got completely. Really into it. And then there was a point I was going to make about the first game, but it's also in 2, the random free run mode that's in the games, where basically you just drive about the tracks and stuff. And whenever people talk about how, Paradise, they took it in a direction they never intended and it ruined the experience, I would argue the fact that Freerun was there from the very beginning would imply to me that Criterion always had an interest in creating a more open book experience. And the fact that it returns in 2 kind of backs that up for me. Like putting in a mode where basically it's just about driving around. Like to me, whenever I think about the series and I hear that being said, I always think it's maybe a little bit short-sighted, because I think from the very beginning, if you can see the foundations of what 3 became from 1 and 2, I think you can also see the foundations of what Paradise would end up becoming and what that stood for in the Burnout series. So I think 2 is really interesting because it's like it's the point right before the change where this series truly reaches the spotlight. And because of that, it's for me 2 just basically exists as being one with a bit more content and having some personality now, and nothing really justifies that more than the introduction of the custom coupe.
Right, exactly. Well, yeah, I think Crash Mode is something to highlight because, you know, Crash Mode is obviously one of the most popular aspects of the Burnout experience, to the point where, you know, they arguably, some people would say, perfected it in 3, but Criterion seemed to always have this, like, weird reticence about just doing the same thing twice. And it's something that is so, like, especially after Burnout 2, it just seems like, in my opinion, I feel like they almost shot themselves in the foot with this, like, need to constantly innovate. Because, you know, Revenge brought back the Crash Mode and added a bunch of stuff, the sort of meter to start, and a lot of things that kind of drove people away. The first game, you know, to me, there's 2 parts of what make Crash Mode special, and it's that initial strategy of selecting your route, where you're going to make that strike. But, and I'm obviously talking about Burnout 3 here because that's the one that I love the most. It's also what happens after the crash. And it's also, getting to that crash breaker, being able to hit some of those bonuses, being able to kind of give yourself a second wind. And the reason why, going back, I'm almost surprised that crash mode was such a hit in Burnout 2 is because that second wind does not exist in Burnout 2. There is no crash breaker. There's nothing to pick up. So it's like, it's referred to a lot as like a puzzle mode. I always enjoy when we do research for shows going back and seeing how like journalists and the public sort of perceive these things. Like I remember seeing a lot around PGR that like they compared it to like the Tony Hawk Pro Skater of racing games or whatever with the kudo system, and like this is the puzzle game of Burnout. And that is very much apparent, but like for me even the crash mode doesn't quite hit its zenith in this game. And Pursuits is something that like would completely just disappear. So it's the apex of a different kind of Burnout experience, and I think that's generally the crux of everything that we're getting at. And this is a game that I think if you're after something, if you kind of want to see a different side of that coin, then Burnout 2 is definitely the one to check out. But, we'll be talking about a game later where they actually almost kind of tried to make a spiritual sequel, in my opinion, to Burnout 2. But, that's kind of skipping ahead.
Yeah, no, I totally, I do agree with all of that. With regards to Pursuit, what I realised playing through that again was that it's actually not too dissimilar to the way you earn cars in Paradise. In terms of like a car is a wanted car and you go chase it down. Now obviously in Pursuit it's more of a concentrated hit the car like 10-15 times to
it's Runabout or Driver or any game
exactly. But like in my head, like the kind of correlation, something similar for me was always the way you earn cars in Paradise. But yeah, it too is interesting because it's pretty much the apex of that type of Burnout experience that a lot of people enjoyed. But for me it's a case of being the better of the two original games, because I do feel as if from 3 onwards the series truly found its feet, and I don't even just mean from a gameplay perspective as well, like just presentation wise and everything. I'm still blown away by how exciting a game like 3 feels to be in. I feel as if 1 and 2 kind of missed the mark there because it just feels more like there's window dressing around some core gameplay concepts, but it doesn't feel fully realised. It doesn't feel like a completely full package, which is fair enough, I suppose, since it's the early days of the series. But for me, it's a case of Burnout 2 being a great version of a gameplay concept that would then be perfected from the next game.
Yeah, and I think that puts a pin pretty much in Burnout 2, so at this point, I guess we'll skip several games, or maybe really only one game now that I think about it, and talk about Legends, which I played a little bit of the PSP one. You played, I think, a lot of the DS one, and they're two very different games. Yeah. The PSP one is probably the definitive Burnout Legends experience. Probably. But I don't know. I don't think there's a lot really to talk about with Burnout Legends on the PSP. I think it successfully brought those games to a handheld platform. It combines content from the first 2 games and 3, which kind of makes it weird because it. And I did kind of feel that when I played the game back in the day. It has a lot of the music from Burnout 3, which is key because, like, in the first 2 games, they were published by Acclaim. It was before EA bought Criterion. So they have dynamic music that some people like. I honestly don't. It doesn't do anything for me. It's just kind of like very generic rock. But it does different things when you boost and whatnot. And, with 3 onwards, they were part of the EA family and their whole EA Tracks thing, and we all know, the songs that we associate with those games. Yeah. So Legends is weird because it kind of straddles both. That said, the the Burnout chaining isn't an aspect of the game. It borrows the most from 3 because it has all the cars from 3. It also has takedowns, and it was an early PSP game, and it was good. It ran at 30 frames per second. It was not the prettiest PSP game in the world, but it ran well enough. And if you wanted that Burnout 3 experience on the go, it was a pretty good place to go for that. It was a little tough on that screen seeing the oncoming cars and stuff, and I can only imagine how tough it must have been on the DS version. But yeah, not a whole lot to say about Burnout Legends. Completely competent mobile experience on the PSP, but the DS one, Brent, oh boy.
Yeah, so Burnout Legends DS was not developed by Criterion. I suppose that's the first non-surprise out of the way. It was developed by a French studio called Visual Impact, who developed such hits as E.T. the Extraterrestrial for Game Boy Advance.
Not the one for Atari 2600 that filled up the landfills. Different E.T.
Imagine Babies on Nintendo DS.
I remember those games. I remember the Imagine series.
So they were only in charge of the Babies game, so I'm not sure if that's because that one was just like, it was so good, they were like, we need to give other guys a chance. And then some other ports of like SSX Tricky on the Game Boy as well. Ants with a Z Racing. Yeah, they're based on that strange film. And yeah, so now they actually got to work on Burnout Legends with oversight from Criterion. Wikipedia informs me. I am not sure how much oversight they had on this game, but
yeah,
I chose to play this version, I think much to your surprise, when we were deciding what to go after here, because I did actually own the game when I first had my DS. As a bright and bushy-eyed early teen now, I was of that mindset of playing racing games everywhere and anywhere that I could.
Yeah, of course.
And you could argue not much has changed in that regard, since I always end up in this position doing this type of stuff. Yeah, I remember buying it at the time, and I did have a PSP at the time with Legends, and I still bought the DS version when I got my DS. And man, oh man, this is a very strange game. So what you basically have is a developer who is trying to replicate Criterion's style of Burnout game as of 3 onwards on hardware where this should have never been attempted. Because the technical limit...
They shouldn't have even tried.
No, it's true though, like... It's the fact that it exists is so strange to me purely because I don't know anybody that would want a definitive experience on a DS, and people say this type of shit about the Switch, or who would want to play it on the Switch, but the Switch can still approximate a regular experience to a certain degree. But taking Burnout, that was pioneered to show off renderware in the first place when it was first conceived, was like perfected to oblivion from free with EA's money. And then you're trying to like almost take that type of experience and put it on a handheld that could barely play 3D games in general in terms of anything outside of Nintendo type stuff. It's weird. I'm trying to actually put into words the way the game plays. It's kind of like if you tried to play Burnout Legends on PSP but the buttons and the analog stick were made of sponge. There's like this there's this weird like disconnect between whatever's happening to the vehicle and what's the gameplay actually looks like as well, because it's as if somebody's just smeared like dirty water all over the screen.
I just see a lot of like, I'm watching footage of it off screen, because if you watch footage of Burnout Legends DS on YouTube, I want to point out everyone seems to like want to increase the rendering resolution so it looks like an okay game, but yeah, that's not how it would have looked on the DS screen. I'm watching like off-screen footage, and it's like, yeah, it's kind of like somebody described Burnout over the phone. Like, and it's funny because like I'm watching a race on the Silver Lake track that was in Burnout 3, and like this is that track. Like there are various aspects of it that resemble Silver Lake, but the way that the car moves, you know, it almost feels like a Flash game.
It reminds me of the first Ridge Racer on PS1, the car movements, just that weird like on a pivot almost, like when it turns.
Yeah, and here's the thing, like I actually disagree with you. I think that they could have made a respectable Burnout game on this platform. And to be honest, like, the frame rate seems very smooth. You were saying before the show that like you almost thought it was like 60. Like, it seems very consistent, which to me proves that like there was potential here. You know, it's not like Sega Rally on the Game Boy Advance where it's like it's hard to look at. I think it's just down to the fact that it was developed by a studio that didn't maybe understand the core fundamentals of the Burnout handling.
Yeah.
And there's aspects of it that look decidedly low budget, like just even the text. I know, like, you know, I always look at like fonts and stuff like that and make a big deal out of it. No one gives a shit except me. But like even like the HUD, like it looks like it was maybe rushed or maybe not given the love that other versions of this game received. And I mean, it's on the DS, so that wouldn't be terribly surprising. I remember how 3 was, it felt like such a glow up for the series. It felt like the production values were just like through the roof. I remember that's like what surprised me the most, having played a little bit of 2 and going to 3. And you feel that in Legends on the PSP to an extent, but you don't feel it here.
No.
So, yeah.
And I think that's the thing, like, it's not so much I don't think you can make a good Burnout experience on DS, but for me, I don't see it happening for what the series is from 3 onwards. And this is where I suppose we almost circle back to the start in terms of I could absolutely imagine the original Burnout gameplay concepts working very well on DS. So less reliant on the bombastic brill nature of it and more reliant on the kind of accurate driving and avoiding of traffic, that sort of thing, being punishing but fair. I feel as if a limited scope would have done this game the world of good, but obviously they wanted to try and approximate what Legends as an experience was on the PSP, just for a different audience. But like, there's too many technical limitations in play that kind of detract from that anyway. Even if the controls were great, which sadly they do fall a bit short, there just isn't enough like kind of traffic cars on the road, so everywhere feels very empty, and that detracts from the experience. The actual kind of crash animations aren't so much as animations as it seems like somebody clicking on one of the car objects and kind of dragging it around with a mouse to give it some like vision of movement.
The way the chase cam works is like kind of making me dizzy.
Yeah, exactly, and it's even worse on the DS because it doesn't have that up-res and everything's so mushy, and there's like it's like a weird, like, it's not motion blur, but there's like a kind of
they tried to do a motion blur, and you shouldn't try to do motion blur on the screen this low resolution.
Yeah, it's so strange. The actual kind of content of the game is fair enough. There's a world tour mode where basically you go around all the tracks, you unlock cars, you unlock new races. But what's really cool about the world tour mode is it introduces the idea of the car having a health bar. So you take damage during the race, and then on the bottom screen it actually replicates where the car is most damaged and the level of health that it has left. Reach 0 and it's game over.
That's not something that was ever present in any other Burnout game.
Exactly.
When you do road rage, you know, there is a health associated with your vehicle, but you only know about it when it says, you know, I can't remember what good damage, critical damage. Will pop up on the screen, but yeah, having this meter, like, to tell you where your car is most damaged is pretty wild, because that was never a thing Criterion tried to do in any of their games.
Exactly, and I think for some of the kind of later tournaments and stuff as well, the damage carries over from race to race and stuff as well. So there was definitely something cool in that element, and for me that's what I'm always intrigued about when it comes to ports like this, is the ways in which a developer tries to make it unique for the platform, because they know they can't actually replicate the experience exactly. The reference point that I always use, and it's not a racing game so I won't go on about it too long, but was when Pro Evolution Soccer 2008 came out on the Wii. Not only did they have a full different gameplay mode for that, they basically turned it into a real-time strategy game, and it's fucking great. But the actual gameplay, it's honestly worth checking out. I say that to everybody listening as well, it's interesting. But they took like the typical kind of sport career mode and basically turned it into a card game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or something like that, where basically you would start with a team of nobodies, generics, and you would basically every point in the career you would choose between playing 5 different teams, and for each team it would say like this guy's deck has a 5-star playmaker from Argentina, and like then just say other stuff, but it would never specifically say who the players were, if they would have compatible chemistry for like the rest of your players, that sort of thing. So you basically worked your way through the game, building up a squad through that kind of like like trading card game type switching. I've always been a bit weary of the fact that Ultimate Team then started up and it had a similar idea.
That's exactly what I was thinking the whole time you were talking about that, yeah.
Yeah, but imagine taking that concept and putting it in a cool gameplay mode that wasn't trying to be predatory towards microtransactions.
That's the thing. It's a really cool idea if you take away the loot boxes and, making children pay for things part, yeah.
Exactly. And there was cool things as well, like you get shiny versions of the cards, that sort of thing. I don't want to go on about it too long, but basically what I was getting around to saying without too much waffle is that when you're working within technical limitations and you have a unique piece of hardware or something, coming up with a way to make the game unique for that platform and make it still enjoyable is very important. And I think the biggest issue for Legends for me is that it doesn't quite go far enough for that. Like the World Tour mode is cool, but technically that could have been replicated it could have been replicated on the PSP. You just put the fucking card damage thing on the actual HUD as opposed to the second screen.
Yeah, I mean it had the PSP. I mean the World Tour, it had like the World Tour map.
Yeah,
just like Burnout 3 did. It didn't have that damage that carried over, but yeah, no, it's a neat idea. It's one of those things like if you're trying to kind of gear this for the system, you almost have to go all out. It seems like they just didn't know what to do, how far to take it.
One of the things that I often thought about was the idea of a multi-car crash mode that you use the touchscreen to control from like a bird's eye view. So you would have the actual kind of junction on the top screen, and then on the bottom screen you could have it so that there was multiple entry points for the cars, and you could draw the pathways that they were going to take, and then you could have had like a cool kind of crash mode based on like a kind of drawing out pathways and stuff.
Yeah, what if you did a crash mode? This is weird and maybe a terrible idea, but what if you did a crash mode where like the Burnout car you didn't control? Instead you set the traffic patterns using the touchscreen. Yeah. Why don't they pay us, man? Mate,
I know, 100%. And it's funny too because you think about that concept and I can't even remember the name of the board game, but Rush Hour I think it was, or something like that, where basically you had to get a tiny red car out of the kind of like 4x4 grid by moving lorries and that type of thing to basically create the pathways to move the car out. I think it was like Traffic Jam or Rush Hour or something it was called. And that's just like so right for like a DS version of like Burnout. And that's when I say like, don't bother if you're not going to try and accommodate for the hardware. And that's the biggest issue I have with Legends. It's a downgraded experience that doesn't add enough to justify its existence when, for me, like we're talking about, I think you agree, Adam, like you make use of what hardware you have. If you're happy enough to show off the PSP at the time in terms of like, the graphics and replicating a console-like experience, the DS at that point had already established itself as a unique platform that could offer different kinds of experiences, and the Burnout type gameplay was rife to add some stuff in there. So that's the biggest disappointment from even playing it with a Fanatec wheel. I was still left a bit disappointed.
No, it's interesting because like there was that mobile game that they had, Burnout Crash, which we won't be talking about, but and I actually don't know anything about it. But I was thinking about like maybe the issue with the DS is that the DS was just capable enough to convince them that they could make a game like Legends.
Yeah.
But not actually capable enough to really realize it, where like it might have been more interesting to see them try to do a Burnout game on the GBA that was like not 3D, not a conventional racing game, but like, you know, I don't know, was really focused on the crash mode and had some sort of puzzle aspect to it that was like from an isometric view or something, you know, like these are kinds of things that like when you really have no choice but to like go for something else, that's what you do. And they were neither here nor there with the DS. So and they were probably like, hey, you know, it's our audience isn't really on the DS, so like if it's not the best Burnout experience on the handheld platform, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, this type of thing always comes down to priority. It was probably easy enough to hand it out to an external developer and approximate some form of driving experience when there weren't that many outside of the Mario Kart and stuff, and that's kind of highlighted by Nintendo Life back in the day, giving it a 5 out of 10, but in the final closing comments remarked that it's one of the better racers on the system. So like, you can give it a 5 out of 10, it has that. And 5 out of 10 is very fair. I always just have a weird soft spot for these type of racing games on platforms they probably shouldn't be on, though. Like, as has been evidenced when I talk a lot about GBA racers and stuff. I think it's an interesting view, because I always remember when I was playing this back in the day when it first came out, it made me believe that you could have like Sega Rally 95 or something on the DS, and it was like, oh man, that'd be so cool, just because it looks like a fucking Saturn game or something. Like,
yeah, I mean, you could, and there were some GBA games that, you know, we had the episode with John Lemon where we talked about like V Rally 3 on the GBA is amazing, and you know, I didn't have that one, but I did have Top Gear Rally, and that had a fantastic engine. That absolutely could have been a Saturn game, and honestly looks better than like some early Saturn racing games by like third-party devs. So it's when it works, when it's done right, which is obviously very rare because of the massive technical lift that is required, it's very impressive. And when it doesn't, it does make you wonder why they bothered, I guess. But that's unfortunately sort of the both sides of that sword. But yeah, so Legends is a weird game, depending on where you play it. Another weird one is Burnout Dominator. First off, did you ever play Dominator? Because I completely ignored it. I knew it was out there, and I did not care.
Yeah, I've always known about it, but I kind of just like correlated it with Legends for some reason. In my head, I was just like, it's probably just another best of compilation of Burnout content. So sadly, no, I haven't played it, but I'm curious to hear what your experience of it was.
Right. So with Dominator, they basically wanted to have a Burnout experience for people who had PS2s, and the PSP was completely in its, like, you know, squarely in the middle of the PSP's lifespan. And by 2007, you know, people had already moved on. It wasn't quite like today where there are still people who can't get their hands on the new system. People had moved on to 360 and the PS3 and the Wii, but like they wanted something for the massive install base that the PlayStation 2 had. So what they did was, while Criterion was working on Burnout Paradise, which wouldn't come out for I think like another year and a half, they had EA UK, which is important to this show because they are also the developers of Shocks, make a Burnout game. And it's called Burnout Dominator. And at the time I remember ignoring it because obviously the 360 and the PS3 was the new hotness. Burnout Paradise, I can't remember if I knew anything about the game at that point, but obviously they were working on something new. Probably the year before, I just played Revenge on the 360, and that was a cross-gen game, but it looked pretty good. So yeah, Dominator is a weird one because I wouldn't even say it feels like it comes from another studio. I think that's the most interesting thing about it. I sort of expected that it would feel more distant from the other Burnout games of its time. And it does in some ways, but the production, like, I was surprised to find that, like, this doesn't feel like a game that they just, like, pushed out there so they had something that people with PS2s could buy. Because that's completely what I expected. Yeah. And fans don't seem to take it super seriously because it was kind of in that no man's land, the time when the generation was changing. So I was surprised to find I actually like the game a lot. I've been playing it on the PSP, and some people will probably be like, why would you choose that one if you've never played the game before? But the thing is, like, the PSP in some respects kind of seems like their lead platform on this one, because with the PS2 they were like, well, this system has been around for 7 years. We pretty much know everything we could do with it. We basically maxed out our potential with Burnout 3, so there's not much to be gained there. Yeah. But and they were using renderware. They're using the Burnout engine, just like Criterion would have done. But with the PSP, they were very focused on improving upon Legends. And visually, they do that. It's a very, like, dense, detailed game on PSP. Runs at 30 frames per second, but is super stable, super smooth. It's honestly, like, it might be too detailed because, again, with Burnout, you run into that problem where, like, oncoming cars and stuff becomes a real issue. And, I've been playing it on my Vita, so things are a little bit pixelated because it's a PSP game with the output resolution, or the display effectively doubled, so things are a little pixelated and it can be hard to see. And the Vita's OLED screen makes, like, everything super saturated, so I feel like the game is almost like a little bit more visually over-simulating than it should be. But it's a good one, and without going on about this too long, without giving you a chance to chime in, Brent, the thing about Dominator is that they were really trying to... It seems like they were very inspired by those first two games. Yeah. And it seems like they took the opportunity of making a game for the PS2 and the PSP only as an excuse to kind of take Burnout back to its roots in a sense. You still have takedowns, but the actual Burnout chaining mechanic returns. And it is all over Dominator. Everything that you do in every mode, it can be enhanced, or you're expected to do burnouts. And they have a lot of modes in this game that wouldn't appear in other games. While it lacks crash mode, there's a mode called Maniac mode, which the closest thing I can compare it to is like some sort of like kudos attack or something in PGR. Like you're just trying to drift or whatever, gain points to pass a certain threshold. There's drift challenges. There's still burning laps like there are in the other games. There's a Burnout challenge where you're just trying to chain as many of those as possible. There's a whole mode around near misses, which is actually it's not very well done because it counts anytime you hit a vehicle but don't crash as a near miss. Oh, okay. So it's not very stringent. Definitely not as much as the pros who love Burnout 2 would prefer. But yeah, it has a lot of different things going for it. And it exists in this weird middle ground between where Burnout was and was going, kind of like very much of that revenge era, but also taking a lot of inspiration from the earlier games. And I think it is worth checking out because it just feels weird. It's something that I knew was out there, completely passed me by, and it's always fun when you discover a game like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at some screenshots of the game and stuff as well, and I don't know if I'm just imagining it, but it seems to have like a different kind of visual flair to it. Not sure if that's just due to the different developer, but it seems as if things are a lot more brighter and cartoony, almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think
it's
that
not as grungy as like Revenge.
Yeah.
Like it totally ditches like the next gen filter, and it almost, it's sort of like Burnout 3, but maybe even it pops a little bit more, and like I feel like there's like more objects, there's more detail in everything.
Yeah, I think that's what really stands out to me as well. Like I think it might actually be the car designs more than anything seem to have more of that kind of, these are fictional cars, so let's give that extra little bit of fantasy. If that makes sense. I think
they actually look pretty cool. There's like it's the one that I think you always see, but it's like the American Classic or I think the Drift Classic. They have very generic names because they didn't have like the manufacturer names they had in Paradise. I think it's a Drift Classic, but it looks like some sort of like, it's like an Aston DB5 with 4 headlights, but is like way weirder. It's a really neat car. Some of these are almost like, they almost feel like if they ever made like a Ridge Racer with like, oh, here's like an Assoluto from like the 70s. This is what it would look like, you know? Kind of neat.
Yeah, it definitely is. I'm actually pretty frustrated that I've never actually given this a go. Just purely because especially because the Shocks developer made it, first off.
They make good stuff.
But just because it's a total blank on my knowledge of the Burnout series then, because I've actually played Crash, but I've never played Dominator because I just assumed it would just be a similar approach to Legends, but now I really feel like I've got to give it a go. I'd probably go for the PSP version myself. I can see why the PS2 version would be considered the best, but I always feel as if these type of offshoot titles do tend to work best on a portable for some reason, so I'd probably play it on my Vita, to be honest.
Yeah, I did want to bring up that the director on this one, Nick Channon, did a lot of interviews about the game when it came out, and there's a really good one he did with on the Kikizo archives, where he kind of teases into like how they really took the PSP seriously, and they talk about like, oh, we really focus on the PSP handling so it feels good on the D-pad or the nub, but like it doesn't. Like, I mean, I'm playing on the Vita, which is a little bit different, but they're like, oh, you couldn't do drifts in Legends, but it's like easier. It's honestly too touchy for me. It's a little bit too touchy. And like, as much as I love Burnout, I've never thought Burnout was an amazing handling game. I think Burnout handles exactly as well as it needs to for what it's trying to do. I think that's also the reason why, like, I think pure racing in Burnout is never fun, and that's probably why, or not never fun, but not as fun as it could be, and that's why I go for like the 3 and the Revenge. But he did this interview with IGN, and it's just like, I just want to bring it up because it makes me feel, as someone who kind of also does this for a living, I just can relate very hard because, you know, the first question out of the gate is like, why is Dominator exclusive to Sony platforms? And Nick Chan says, you know, we're always looking for ways to leverage the hardware. There's still millions of people out there with PS2s, and we believe this is going to deliver an intense next-gen style experience, especially on the PSP. Fair enough. But then further down, I guess, I don't know if the IGN journalist was not keyed in or what, but they ask, have there been any changes to the way crash mode works? And the game doesn't have crash mode. So Nick Channon, very PR response, goes, Burnout Dominator is very much focused on skill-based driving and pure racing. In many ways, what fuels Burnout is that moment of high tension when you just avoid a crash at insane speeds with your finger firmly pressed on the boost. In Burnout Dominator, we spend a lot of time and effort. So he never says, like, this game doesn't have crash mode. And it's just like, anyone who has ever tried to conduct an interview and get something out of someone knows that feeling where it's like, so you're just not going to admit the thing, are you? You're just going to keep kind of playing the stance. And also, it feels distinctly like an interview that was carried out over email. That's the other thing.
Yeah, it's just like canned responses.
Yeah.
It's especially awkward because, like, you could argue Paradise didn't have crash mode as well, like in terms of what people see as being crash mode, because I remember at the time people were really pissed off about the way Paradise implemented crash mode.
My hot take, my spicy hot take is if you get really into Showtime and Paradise, it's better than crash mode.
Wow.
It's more fun. It lasts forever, and you can trigger it at any time. Like, and I feel bad because when I played Paradise, I completely ignored that. I was like, this isn't crash mode. And then when Remastered actually came out, they did, and I was like, holy shit, this is brilliant. And also, like, I'm not advancing in the game. I'm just constantly doing showtime. And I don't know. I think it's a really brilliant idea. That said, I don't see why you can't do both. But
I think like it comes down to that Burnout 2 versus what happens next side of things, where I think like crash mode is definitely for people who probably prefer Burnout 2's style of gameplay, and Showtime's more along the lines of like Burnout 3 onwards, that kind of all thrills, cool experience that you can like have the most fun with. I think Crash is more of a case of like the first time you play Crash mode and you make an arse of yourself by like crashing into one car and stuff, it can feel frustrating. Whereas in Showtime, right off the bat, you're just fucking bouncing between cars. You're keeping going as long as possible, like you're saying.
Yeah, so you say like the first time making an ass out of yourself. So something I actually wanted to bring up. The worst thing about this era of Burnout, whether you're talking about Dominator, to a certain extent Paradise, definitely Revenge, but Dominator might actually be the worst, is the unskippable tutorials of how to play the game, and also the constant just barging in with like when you're doing the first, for example, you're doing the first Road Rage, and it's like, this is how you boost. Now take someone out, and you haven't taken them out yet, and it's like, did you forget how to take someone out? Here's how you do it. And then like how burnouts work, it's like chain burnouts. It's like, okay, I need boost to be able to do that. And it keeps trying to get you to do it, and you don't have boost, and then you have it, and each time if you don't do it right, it tries to explain it to you again, and it drove me up a fucking wall. I was like, I almost thought the game was broken with the regularity with which it tried to explain the burnout function in Dominator specifically. It's madness, and these games are so bad at it. If you go back to Burnout 2, you know, it's amazing. You can't do anything in that game until you've done the driving school, which is like 4 or 5 little license tests. They don't take long. Yeah. But you can't even do like a single race.
No. You cannot.
It seems like Criterion was very concerned about people not understanding the game, which makes sense early on, but by the time Burnout, by the time Revenge came out, it's like we all understand how Burnout works, you know?
It's so intuitive as well as a game. Like that's kind of the credit I was given 3 onwards, where it's like the first 2 minutes or so you really get a grasp for what the game's about, and just kick on from there, and you just pick up all the other things like aftertouch and all that type of stuff. I can't remember if that's the official name for it. Like you just kind of pick that up as you play. You don't need to over explain it, but the start of Paradise is the exact same, really.
It's awful. That was like the thing that prevented me, because like when they came out with it on the Switch, I was like, I'm gonna buy the game on the Switch again, because like it's Paradise, it's fun anywhere. But I was like, what's keeping me from doing it is I don't want to sit through all of the intrusive, dumb explainers for the first like 20 minutes of the game. Like that was enough to just kind of like make me like, do I really want to start Paradise all over again? Ugh.
Oh, man, it's certainly something. There was a specific segment I wanted to do in this podcast about Burnout, by the way, because what I realised trolling through articles and stuff is that the advertising agencies really fucking hate Burnout, like big time. So the way these games have been advertised throughout the years has attracted ire so many times, and I just wanted to call out some of these. I don't suppose you've seen any of them, Adam. Like some of
I'd seen one story about like what Acclaim tried to do with the second game, which you might know about. So
we'll start with that one then, since that is the earliest of the 3 stories that I'm going to run through. So, effectively, when Burnout 2 came out in the UK, Acclaim offered to reimburse any driver in the United Kingdom who received a speeding ticket. Following a negative reaction to this from the UK government, not even the advertising agency actually, the fucking UK government, the plan was cancelled.
Incredible.
And then the Department of Transport spokesman actually went on record with a statement about this and said, if they want to foot what is likely to be a hefty bill, that is their choice. but we cannot condone something that so obviously encourages people to break the law and do something dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, I have another one, not to take you off track, but Acclaim, which Acclaim was, I think, headquartered in Long Island, which is where I was born, New York, so that's kind of hilarious. But they had a thing for, like, I don't know, their marketing department was like on something, because they had crazy ideas and they never turned out well. There was a whole thing around the game Shadow Man where they tried to, I'm assuming, hoping with the consent of the families involved, like put ads for the game on gravestones.
Holy shit.
Yeah, the Acclaim was wild. They had that whole BMX Triple X game, like the Dave Mirra offshoot that was like was all raunchy and shit, and like was adults only or wanted it to be. Yeah, that was them. So anyway, just wanted to chime in and say that was their bag.
No, absolutely. But apparently it followed Burnout as Acclaim sadly left us, because when Burnout Revenge came out, EA ran an ad campaign in various European magazines and such that basically had a car, and then etched into the car with like a key, as if somebody would key a car, all these terms like crash, burn, road rage, all this shit, like inscribed in the relevant languages. Yeah, just like modes from the game inscribed in like German, Swedish, whatever. And apparently, and I couldn't get exact verification of this, but it would make sense, somebody on Reddit said that the German ads agency pulled the ads because it was encouraging revenge type actions for people who would key cars, or in some cases they believed it would also influence minors and youths who want to cause some issues. So I can actually find the ad and show you that. You're probably able to find it pretty easily as well. If you just type in like Burnout Revenge magazine ad, you'll be able to see a photo of it. But that was like the second controversy that I was able to find. I couldn't find an English version of it at all. So
I found it.
Yeah. Wait, have you found an English version of it, or is it the?
Oh, I don't think I found the English version, but it's on Moby Games, and it's all. It looks so bad too.
Yeah,
it's very strange.
It's probably not the best tact to advertise it that way.
But real quick about Revenge, they wanted to. I think this comes from an interview with Games Radar about the history of the series. I don't remember if it was Alex Ward who said this or someone else, but the original name for that game was supposed to be, what they wanted to call it was Burnout 4 Rush Hour. But EA did not like that. They were like, I think the reason against it was, first of all, no one buys a game with 4 on it. Like, no one buys the 4th sequel of a series, which is just arbitrary and stupid. And 2, they were like, revenge is like, make a revenge, that's what is Rush Hour, like revenge is powerful, it was aggressive, and I guess they thought would play better in the US and stuff. And whoever it was from Criterion was like, I hated it, so there you go.
Thinking away, the game's never really felt like Burnout 4 to me as well. Revenge. I always felt as if Revenge was like a... I don't know, like, see, we were saying like 2's like a 1.5. For me, Revenge was kind of like a 3.5 director's cut remix type game in terms of... I don't know, it just felt as if something was missing to call it a number title. So perhaps going down the Revenge route wasn't too bad.
Well, they also had this whole thing where they did this for Revenge and Dominator. They had the subtitle Battle Racing Ignited. Like, EA went really far to like, I don't know, just like do all this unnecessary branding for Burnout that didn't really need. Also, Dominator is a terrible name. We know this today. In the 2000s, probably wasn't as obvious. And Takedown even was suggested by... Actually, I don't know if it was suggested by EA, but I think the original name for that feature was supposed to be Knockout. And then they were like, but Takedown sounds more American. So they went with Takedown instead. So
that's fair.
Yeah.
I guess
Knockout
kind of has connotations of like boxing and stuff as well. Perhaps it doesn't work as well. But speaking of Dominator, that's the third controversy I have here.
Okay.
So, headline from Wired back in 2007. UK bans Burnout Dominator ad. Complaints from the public have prompted the Advertising Standards Authority to ban an ad for Burnout Dominator in the UK. 37 separate complaints were lodged about the poster, which features a crashed car and the tagline, "Inner peace through outer violence."
Yeah, wow.
EA's stance was that the image was meant to imply that playing Burnout Dominator was a good way to relieve real-life stress, but the ESA was not buying it.
Oh, Jesus.
And it's fair enough. If you see this ad, it's too vague. I think that's what I would describe it as. The tagline itself isn't too bad in isolation, but like this is just genuinely a photo of an absolutely wrecked car with a wheel on fire. They thankfully didn't show any bodies or anything like that, but I can see why the ESA stood in. But I guess this is the issue with trying to advertise a game series like this in the way that the UK and Europe loves doing. I always felt as if our type of advertising differed more from other places in the world, I felt, in the sense that it was always about that more kind of cool, understated factor of kind of trying to correlate something. So one of the ads that has kind of came back into fruition because of a remaster in the series for Klonoa was the magazine ad where it was like, "Baby, do you have Klonoa?"
Yeah,
"Yes, babe,
yeah.
I have Klonoa." And like, there's loads
Which
of
is there's a horrible
ad.
ad, but I also love it. It just makes it has nothing to do with the game. You know, if you've ever seen Klonoa in your life, you would never associate with that imagery.
But that is the point, isn't it? Like, for some reason, with UK ads, it was always about, this is aimed at children, but let's make it cool for adults by having these like weird jokes and stuff. Sega UK were fucking obsessed with it.
They were insane. Like honestly, like the British Sega ads were like, they will make you hurl because they're just they look like bad like Mad Magazine comics or like just awful stuff.
Yeah, and they were all at it. Like Sega were a bit more edgy, of course, but even Nintendo, like there's the Game Boy. It might be the Game Boy Advance SP, and it's like it's a guy just
toilet.
Yeah, there's that one on the toilet as well. But there's also an ad in the same series where it's a guy tied up to the bed by his wife who has like a whip in her hands.
Right, yeah.
And I think it's the Tribal SP or something like that. It's like release your inner wild side or something like that.
Yeah.
And then there's the famous ad that like Miyamoto apparently got really pissed off about, where they had put a tribal tattoo on Mario's like shoulder or something.
Oh god, I remember that. Yeah.
For some reason, UK advertising was always just insane. So yeah, the series like Burnout, where it's so easy to make these type of edgy ads, it was always a bit of a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it is a very weird looking ad because it looks like it was put together in like 5 minutes, and just if you put any other phrase, there's so many other taglines you could put there that probably wouldn't cause alarm, but inner peace through outer violence is it's hard. It's hard to defend.
Yeah, and I think as well, like if like just to get a rough idea, if you ever wanted to have a look, but what I was going to say was it really reminds me of the no seatbelt ad campaigns that were running in the UK right up to like the 2010s, where basically we got some really fucking batshit insane road safety ads when it came to wearing seatbelts, when it came to protecting yourself, PSAs, that sort of thing. And like this, to me, that is directly trying to reference that type of material as well, which I find a bit odd. So, I mean, we had plenty of fucking ads that showed people genuinely getting killed. One of the most batshit insane ones was one that aired in Ireland, where it was about a drunk driver that like careened over a hedge and fucking like the car rolled over a family and shit. Like there's some really insane car safety stuff that goes on over here, and this directly correlates to that for me, and I can see why people would complain.
Yeah, they used to do, I think especially like the New York Department of Health used to do a lot of ads to try and get people to quit smoking, and it would always be, I don't know if they're still doing them, but for a very long time, it would always be people who like had, was like the trach hole in their throat or whatever, and talking, and you would see that, and it was trying to dissuade you from doing something with like the most like poignant imagery possible. Which brings us back to Thrill Drive. So yeah, circle.
The last one I want to reference was like a very targeted campaign towards school children, where basically in every school pretty much you would have like all the photos of everybody in the year. So like as primaries we would say, so the primary 1 through 7 is like the lower school years. and then there was like a poster that schools were putting up beside all these people, and it was like a photo of a kid in like kind of the school uniform and the typical type of frame that you would buy school photos in, and underneath the person it would say like, don't remember this kid, and it was like Niall did his school when he died in a car crash or something like that. And it was like, I always pure avidly remember it because it was genuine. Like, what the fuck, man? Like, why was that even allowed? But they had that poster campaign in schools, and then they actually had a specific ad that they ran on TV that showed what happened to this fictional child in your school type thing.
Oh, jeez.
And it, honestly, man, they were absolutely on one with this stuff, and that's why I think, like, if that wasn't such a prominent thread in UK advertising for road safety and stuff, this type of thing might have flown, but I can see why it kind of triggered a bit of ire.
Yeah. This just, not to get carried away with ads, but, like, all of this reminded me, I remember seeing this ad for MSR on the Dreamcast when I was a kid, and my brother had the Dreamcast official magazine, and I didn't get it because I was, like, 7, so I wouldn't. But it's got, like, it's got tire marks. It's got 2 different sets of tire marks by like a corner in what looks like San Francisco. And there's like tire marks associated with driver A, and there are tire marks that are like all over the place and doing like circles. It looks like he crashed with driver B. And driver A, it says, you know, their tire marks are neat and tidy, and they went through the corner well, and they say, it says, greets colleagues with a firm self-confident handshake, dated cheerleaders in high school, has lipstick on underwear, smokes after sex. Meanwhile, driver B, who isn't as good at driving, offers a limp and clammy handshake that screams of self-doubt, wasn't allowed to date in high school, has superheroes on underwear, and apologizes after sex. So, yeah, I mean, I think it seems like it was mostly a thing in the UK, but like this kind of advertising was still sort of like on the mind in like the early 2000s. It seems like mid 2000s all over the world, and it's just so weird. And I feel like, especially like, not to go off on the Sega Dreamcast tangent or whatever, it's like I feel like when companies are desperate, they're like, we gotta throw everything at the wall because if we don't, we're going bankrupt. And it's almost what I see coming out of MSR.
That, man, you could probably do a full episode on these crazy fucking ads and commercials, or maybe a live stream or something just to go through them, because, oh man, some of them are crazy. Surprisingly, I think Gran Turismo managed to stay relatively safe, which is a surprise given that PlayStation loved a bit of edgy advertising, but I guess if a series oozes class compared to the way Burnout oozes danger, then it sort of makes sense. But I do find it pretty funny that we've spent a good bit talking about like driver safety ads and all that type of thing to cap off an episode about Burnout.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, there's a lot of crossover, and this was good. This went in a direction that, like, I love the sort of garbage time portions of the episode where it's like, I don't know what the fuck we're gonna get up to, but it's usually interesting. Yeah. Always manage to bring something new to the table. But yeah, this was a nice discussion, and I'm not ruling out ever talking about, like, you know, 3 and Revenge in Paradise, but like to find a way to do it that isn't just like, this is the best game ever, this one's slightly worse, you know. So
yeah, exactly, that's the thing. These games have been discussed to death in the later phases, and like you're saying, there's only so much you can say in terms of superlatives. Whereas for these games that we've talked about today, including like the DS version of Legends and stuff, it's more of a case of looking at the outer reaches, and I think bringing up Dominator was a really cool thing, purely because a lot of people would have missed that for the same reasons I did, in terms of just maybe expecting it's not even a spin-off experience really, just a kind of standard Burnout experience before Paradise came out. But yeah, I think that for me, kind of closing comments for the Burnout series, I think every entry probably has a reason to play it, even if those early games it's not so much that they are fantastic hidden gems or anything like that, but you really get to see the foundations of how a series goes, because from the first game to 2 to 3 is like an incredible trajectory of realisation for what the concept is and how Criterion get there. And then Legends, it's interesting. I guess it's not particularly special, but I think that seeing what was capable on the PSP when it first came out is interesting. And then from the DS point of view, it's more of a case of what could have been, maybe perhaps with a bit more effort. Yeah, Burnout as a series for me, still absolutely one of my favourites around. I never really buy into this mode of thinking that, like, I think over time people have started to sour towards Paradise, but I still fucking love Paradise.
No,
like,
Paradise is great. I mean, with that game, they, from the research that I did about the other games, Paradise, I still came across it, and like, they were really not sure how they were going to bring that game into an open world, and it was something that there was an ambition to do, but it's also just like, how the fuck are we going to make this work? And they pulled it off, and they pulled it off in like a lot of really cool little ways that, like, I feel like sort of get missed, but that will send us down a whole nother tangent. But yeah, Burnout overall, like, I think about the series a lot like how I think about PGR, and that, like, there's never been a bad Burnout game. Like, I'm not gonna hold the DS one against them because they didn't really make it or have much to do with it, but there's never been a bad Burnout game. It's always been kind of an upward trajectory for a series, and even if, like, okay, you like 3 but you didn't like Revenge as much, or you like 3 and Paradise was good, but you wanted a more linear experience, like, I could totally see how any of those 3 games are someone's favorite, and that, I think, is the mark of a good series, when you get to that point where it's like, it's maybe not so much continuous innovation, but it's continually bringing something that is at that consistent level of quality that's maybe a little bit different, but each one has its fans, and Burnout is a poster child for that. So, we haven't gotten a new one in a very, very long time, but a lot of the series, you wish for that, and then it doesn't turn out well. So, I think Burnout will come back one day, and when it does, I don't think that they're going to let it be bad, because they've never done that with this series.
I think that's probably my shot in the dark to say in this episode about the potential return of Burnout. I think it's actually a bit closer than we think.
We know nothing.
Yeah, I'm absolutely clear, okay? I'm not hinting towards anything or anything like that, or we've heard through the grapevine or anything like that, but I just have a gut feeling that Burnout isn't as far away as we think. And for me, it was when Paradise Remastered got released, it was so strange because it could have been released at any number of points before when it did. And I don't know if it's like, do you bring back Burnout 3? Do you make a new game? I just, from my perspective, I can see, and once again, no, absolutely nothing, just making it very clear. I think that EA will be more geared towards bringing back 3 as opposed to making a new game, because I feel as if with Paradise, they're ticking off that box of what Burnout was when it disappeared, and I think by bringing out 3 again and allowing a new generation of gamers to play that on the likes of the Switch, the PS5, that sort of thing, they'll really be in a position where they can evaluate what that means going forward, even if that means Criterion's Need for Speed once again, where they take that series, perhaps they have a more concentrated effort at it instead of what happened with Most Wanted, where they kind of just took Paradise and retrofitted it into a Need for Speed experience in a worse way. I don't know if I'm just blathering nonsense, but for me, I don't think Burnout is as far away as we think it is. I'm not sure why. I've just got a feeling that we're going to see some of it at some point.
They still consider it one of their pillars of racing series. If you look at their earnings report, I think the first one, like right after the Codemasters acquisition, was like completely ratified and everything. They're like, we have Dirt, we have F1, we have Grid, and then on the EA, that was the Codemaster side, and on the EA side, we have Need for Speed and Burnout, and they consider Remastered, the last release in that series, and yeah, I don't think it's ever gone. I think the issue that always is like how does Criterion split its time, and that studio has gone through so much over the last decade and change. A lot of people went to Ghost, a lot of people came back from Ghost, could it grow to a point where it could support 2 games? They have a lot of talent with Codemasters. It's right there and very good at what they do. Could they help? There's a way for them to do it, I'm sure, if they really want to. It's just that, like, EA is EA. They're very risk averse, and it's funny because Burnout has, I think, really the most goodwill out of any of their racing games, and maybe like top 3 of like EA franchises total, because they haven't had an opportunity to fuck it up in the last 20 years or last.
I've got a feeling you're kind of alluding to the skate news that broke today, perhaps. What that's going to be, and maybe if you think about a new Burnout experience and try and tie in the principles they're trying to put on that series, do you get a Burnout Battle Royale, easy asset flip with Paradise City? Know what I mean? Like free to play.
An experience like Paradise could be a service. I mean, do you want that? Which is why, like, if they just re-release 3 remastered, I'd be like, that's fine. I'm good with that.
It'd be absolutely perfect. And I think what the kind of skate news proves is that you should be careful what you wish for, I suppose. Like you're saying, like, can Criterion really dedicate the time and resources to a proper new Burnout game? Maybe not, but like free Takedown remastered can absolutely happen, and that's why, from my perspective at the moment, that's where I'm leaning. I genuinely believe that is something that can happen and will happen at some point. But like I say, total shot in the dark. There's no basis for this whatsoever. I just have a strange feeling that free will return, so we'll see.
It's easy when the game is sitting there. There's not anything that they have to rethink in terms of how can we make money off this or whatever. It's like, if the people who are like fanatics about this series want it, they will pay $30, $40, maybe even more, because it's EA, to get it, and they know that. So,
Yeah, they did nothing for remastered pretty much, but I mean, everybody still bought it in droves. I think it sold really well, and the Switch version is fantastic. Just like, it's so crazy playing that type of game on a handheld, as silly as that sounds. But there's still room for Burnout. Like you were saying, if EA are still referencing it, they understand that. I think with the Codemasters acquisition, it's about finding the right place for the right time for the right franchises just now for them on the racing game front, and to cut EA some slack for one of the few things you can do. I don't really envy the situation they're in, having to look at all these racing game franchises and understand where they sit in the entire ecosystem now, because the racing genre is so dominated by such few names now. It's very hard for them to justify every single series and to give every single series the time of day. I just hope that they make the right decisions and they keep the right things around, because Burnout is definitely a series that has a place out there and that it doesn't need to be reinvented, for the love of God. Like, it's a series that's still relevant.
I mean, to that end, have you ever played Dangerous Driving? Because I haven't. This made me really want to give it a go.
Yeah, I feel like that would make sense now to give it a go. I've never actually played it, and I felt for the guys when they made that, because everybody went into the mindset of this should be like a Burnout level experience right off the bat. Like, it's unrealistic to think that's even possible, because racing games are not the cheapest to make, and I've not actually played it myself. Were they making a second game that was going to be open world, if I recall, as well?
Yeah, there's some. I don't know if it's open
world. Did it come out?
But I think there's like a 2. I think they're working on the next chapter in that series. But it's funny how, like, it has takedowns and they call them takedowns. There's nothing stopping them from using that terminology, and so things to look forward to in the future. But that just about wraps it up for us, and this has been really fun. So. No, thank you, Brendan. This has been great.
You do, Adam, and thanks to everyone else for listening. I absolutely loved the Sega GT episode. If anybody listening has not listened to that one, it's worth listening to, and I can say that because I'm not even on it. So I enjoyed it as a listener and fan of Time Extend. It was fantastic.
Thunder brought so much good stuff to that one, so loved having him on. But
yeah, absolutely. I think we've been talking in the background as well about how much guests can add showing what we want to bring to that. And having a guy who just had so much knowledge and information and insight about a game like that was fantastic. And he won't be the only one, put it that way. We know that there are many different games that many people we're aware of in the community, the development space can really talk towards, and we want to give them those soapboxes to prod them and see why they like those things so much.
The nice thing about this genre is it is still weirdly small enough where the people who are the foremost experts on these games, people who dig into the code and stuff, like Zen, for example, who did a lot for Sega GT 2002, like, they are accessible. They want to talk. Yeah. They're just like regular people who know everything and they want to talk about this stuff. And that's great. It's not like it's hard to get a hold of anybody. And even people in the development side. I mean, we talked to Rushy. We've had Paul on a number of times. Like, these guys love everybody. They love games. They want to see stuff like Ridge Racer come back as much as we do. Everybody's just still sort of motivated by the same thing and is super chill to talk to. So we've been fortunate in that way. But it's fortunate for everybody who makes content in this space that you can have people like that on.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think Racing Madness Mark II really illustrated as well how everyone can come together for the right fight. In this case, in the case just past, it was the Suzuki Escudo, and it was really cool just seeing it was almost like a fucking Avengers Infinity War type thing of all of these influencers in the racing game space coming together to draw a battle. And
I don't mind it
on one side, Black Panther on the other. We had different Aero, Rhino guys like that. It was exciting.
I have my personal. Of course, I wanted to see the Basante or the Hornet win it or whatever. Well, definitely the Hornet because it made it to the end. But I don't mind when Time Extend gets co-opted by the biggest racing game influencers in the world. It's just use that they're in our ring for some reason, but they're just throwing their fans at each other. It's fun to watch from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Especially with the memes that you put out.
Mate, prime meme territory whenever we do those Racing Madness things. But it's it's fantastic. I just wanted to shout out the Escudo for winning it. She's a beauty. She did, of course, get put into GT7 by our request after winning. Kaz made the request right away next day. He was like, no worries guys, got that covered. That's exactly how it went down. So congratulations to the Escudo on not only winning Racing Madness but coming back in GT as a result.
Yeah, I've seen people say did they know? They didn't know. No, we didn't know anything. Nobody. I am pretty sure there are people in Polyphony who don't know anything and they work for the company. It's just they're so locked down.
It was pretty
But
funny.
That said, if Kaz wants to change that relationship, we're right here. So
get him on, him and Dan Greenawalt, same episode. Just shoot the shit, see the chaos that happens.
But yeah, this has been a lot of fun. So thanks everyone for listening, and you'll hear from us again soon.
Thanks very much for listening, guys.